My name is Elise Weiner, and I'm the marketing partner for Material Impact. We're a Boston-based venture capital fund, and our investment strategy is really kind of two-pronged, really based on our name. You know, the first is we invest in products enabled by material science innovation, and the second has to do with impact. We really focus on building businesses that have the capacity to solve for large-scale, real-world problems in areas like food, water, industrial productivity, healthcare, security, transportation. So our team has a lot of deep domain expertise in material science, but we also all happen to be former operators, entrepreneurs, CEOs from startups. So we really know what it takes to scale up early stage technologies into products and companies. My role at Material Impact is really focused on working across our portfolio of companies to help translate early, oftentimes university-based technologies into iconic brands with large-scale market appeal. So I work hand in hand with our entrepreneurs to position their technology, which is really what we're here to talk about today, and then develop a compelling commercial narrative that maps directly to the needs of their customers. And I oftentimes work with these companies to launch their product or products for the first time. And since we have a lot of very young companies, early companies, we found that entrepreneurs oftentimes just don't have access to manpower to focus on marketing kind of out of the gate. And that's really where I come in and what we'll be talking a lot about today. So one thing that's kind of common to our investment strategy, which I think is quite relevant to this session today, is that we invest in platform technologies a lot of times. So technologies that have really broad IP and so have the capacity to serve multiple different application areas or multiple different customers. And this can present a lot of challenges and opportunities. I've been a part of startups that have kind of simultaneously pursued multiple verticals in different positions, and then others that have been really laser focused on one audience. So I'm excited to share with you some of those examples today.
Great. And because of that, that's really why we wanted to do this as a workshop, because we believe that this is a pretty common scenario that most startups find themselves in, right? Which is that they might obviously not have the resources. Maybe they're just getting kicked off. And even though they might see a lot of opportunities, they might not be able to pursue all of them at once, and they have to pick an area. But at the same time, they're trying to avoid getting typecast as a machine learning company or as, you know, a hardware company or like some other thing that might be too niche for them and actually kind of hinder their future growth, even if they're doing really well right now. So if you think about that, like, how do you help companies think through that decision, right? The framework for deciding where they start, given a lot of options that they could go after.
Right. Yeah. So, you know, as I mentioned, a platform that can serve multiple verticals is a good thing. But I think we really look to see that a business has prioritized a single focus area to start. But how do you choose that single focus area? I think there are a few different criteria areas that you should think about. I mean, the first is really the size of the market opportunity. You know, we're really looking to make sure that you're solving for a real problem in the marketplace. So a lot of times, I'm sure you've heard the statement like technology in search of a problem, right? We always start with the problem statement, right? So there's a customer that is experiencing a lot of pain in a large, meaningful market, and so is more ready for a new technology and a new solution. So I think, you know, size of the market, that you're solving for a real problem in the marketplace. And then the other thing is, you know, you could be going after a great big market, but if your technology is not really commercially viable for that category, it's probably not a good fit either. So you really want to make sure that, you know, the application you choose is the closest one to, you know, your own commercial and product readiness. And so those are, you know, and I think those three things are important starting points. You know, a lot of the things that we look at as investors, you know, I say this all the time, you just can't be all things to all people out of the gate. You know, I just talked about, you don't have probably manpower to focus on marketing. You also don't have enough manpower to simultaneously pursue multiple things at once. So having that rigorous focus on one application is really important out of the gate.
So what do you think, kind of given that,
Mm-hmm.
that a lot of startups do wrong, either in that process or maybe by not following that process? What's a common mistake that startups make when they're trying to pick the right space without getting typecast?
Yeah, I think that, a lot of times what may end up happening, especially in those early days, is, once you're out in the marketplace, it's really easy to be distracted by incoming kind of inbound customer interest that comes in that's not aligned with your roadmap and where your product is headed. It's very hard to ignore a big brand, right? Or a big customer that comes in and says, listen, I know you're working on this, but could you build us this? And I think it's a mistake to kind of go off in multiple directions that keep you from your roadmap and marching down that path. Now, if you get enough of those calls that are in this area that's completely different from what you're pursuing, it's time to pay attention to that. But I think it's, keep those leads warm, but maintain that kind of rigorous focus. I think another thing that's important, though, to not get typecast is you have that focus, but a kind of a keen understanding of where the capacity, where the technology could grow beyond that. So, especially if you think about leadership within this company, you want to be kind of an evangelist for how your technology is going to change the world, and, an understanding of how you could pursue other areas and really have impact beyond what you're pursuing today. But I think I heard this analogy once that it stuck with me, that startup CEOs are like Olympic athletes. Like, in order to be the best in your sport, you wouldn't train for the 100-meter race and the javelin at the same time, right? You gotta, really kill it in one area before and have success in that space before you can kind of go have permission to go on and try something else.
So now, as we're talking about that, because that's like a great example, right? Like, we tend to think
Yeah.
of, like, in high school, you're probably a good athlete at multiple sports, right? And then
Right.
as you sort of evolve into like professional athletes, you can only kind of focus. But one thing that I've been thinking a lot about, and I know that it comes up a lot in startup world, is the concept of a pivot. Right?
Yeah.
So what's the difference to you between starting your focus in one area and then graduating or evolving into a second area versus actually pivoting? Like, how would a startup kind of think about those differences?
Yeah, I think pivoting is okay. I mean, look at what's happening right now in the whole COVID landscape, right? So when you have the ability to respond to changes in the market and pivot, it shows that you're an adept entrepreneur, right? I think the mistake is an unwillingness to pivot once you've received the market data back that what you're doing isn't working. Um, so, I think as you're thinking about pivoting into a different space, and maybe, and the narrative that you want to be able to tell why you pivoted is not, we were working on this, it wasn't working, so we just picked another space, right? The good narrative is, after testing our business model in this market, we learned through customer discovery, right, and market research and inbound interest that the real need for our product is this, and there's willingness for customers to pay for that, right? That's how you're going to convince your investors or, the people around you that you're making the right decision. But I think another important step before you pivot is kind of taking a look in the mirror, right? It's thinking about how you're structured today. So is there already a deep association in the marketplace between your brand and one application? Do you have the right people, expertise, or network to credibly enter this new space? You may need to do some work to kind of rebrand and rebuild, whether it's adding to your team, whether it's completely rebranding the company to be able to enter into the new category. If the application is just a natural extension of what you're already doing, then there's less work to do. I can, probably give an example here. Actually, one of our portfolio companies actually develops a nano coating that protects electronics from water and environmental damage. So they were actually the first technology to waterproof the iPhone. So when they were developing this technology, smartphones were, waterproofing smartphones was the major market opportunity for them. I mean, for so long, that piece of electronics was cooked if it got any water on it. But now, since then, with the electrification of vehicles and autonomous driving, electronics have really made their way into automotive in a big way. And this company recognized that, yes, pursuing consumer electronics was a good road to market, but they also wanted to pivot into the automotive space and all the opportunities that were there. They're not pivoting their position that they're protecting electronics at the end of the day, but they're able to naturally expand into a new application area without kind of watering down their brand, no pun intended, right? So I think, I think in that case, they don't really need to, other than really understanding the automotive space, which is super important before you enter into a new space, is really understanding that world. They're very naturally able to expand into that area without having to rebrand or rebuild the organization.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to pause for just a second to let the attendees know again. So if you look into the Zoom webinar chat, you'll see a Slido link where you can ask questions. So please feel free to ask questions, because we're going to ask a couple more here, but then we're going to shift into some real world examples that Elise is going to take us through. So Elise, you mentioned earlier the investor perspective, and I wanted to come back to that a little bit, because a lot of times when you're laser focused on a space, it's very successful for the market, right? For the people that you're selling to, but that may not necessarily be a message that resonates with investors. Like, so how do you help your portfolio, or even maybe before somebody who's in your portfolio joins, what are you looking for that's different from the investor perspective in that kind of laser focus, as opposed to what a consumer or a buyer of that technology or other product might look at?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the majority of our portfolio companies are, B2B. So, but we also work with a couple of consumer brands. So slightly different audiences, but I think, yes, one of the things, and Christine, we talked about this, I always think about when you go into a meeting with someone, it's almost like they have a checklist in front of them and they're looking for you to hit these key points. Mm-hmm. And investors will oftentimes have slightly different checklists than a customer might. Here's the good news. If you can really nail kind of customer positioning and have real commercial traction with your audience, whether it's early customer interest or validation or actual customers or revenue or sales, this is going to appeal to an investor, overwhelmingly. So, I've worked with startups that are super early, not even out of the university, but had done early customer research and had real commercial traction out of the gate. So when you hear from a Fortune 100 company that like, hey, if you guys can do this, it's going to change our industry, or hey, we actually want to put our own money into this, that's true validation that an investor can't ignore. So I would say first, if you can really almost obsessively focus on delighting a customer and having traction in that space, you're absolutely going to win over an investor. But that being said, investors also care about some other things that you might want to think about when you position yourselves to that category, that group. They care about the novelty of the technology and the IP and the team, right? And, that you're working in a space that they believe, that maybe they're really focused on, or they believe is growing or ripe for disruption. So, I think we talked about, there are VCs, for instance, that are, focused entirely around AI and machine learning. And so they're going to care that this is a really smart group from Cambridge who's renowned in this subject area, and we want to be involved with this group of entrepreneurs that are kind of changing this space. In our world, and a lot of times we work with customers in manufacturing, right? In automotive, these are risk-averse customers, right? They could care less about universities or publications. They just want to know that this thing that you're selling them works, that it's, tried and tested, that you're not a fly-by-night startup that's going to go away tomorrow. Because a lot of times you kind of have to put yourself in their shoes. If they stick their neck out and adopt a new technology and it fails or it stops their business altogether, right? Their job's on the line. So you don't sell them on your team or your tech necessarily. You sell them on results, on customers that have come before them and have been successful, on how easy this will be to integrate into the way they already run their business. And so that's where that kind of nuance between the two groups comes in.
Great. So now thinking about maybe the CEO or the founders picked the space that they think make the most sense. Now we're actually shift into marketing to actually positioning,
yeah,
right? Messaging to that audience. Do you need a marketing person to do that? Like if you didn't have a marketing person, what are the things that a CEO or founder might start? And then how does that flow into what the marketing person might take over?
Yeah, I mean, not necessarily, and I'm saying that as a marketing person. I think if you are a CEO or you're a part of an early stage company and you actually come from the industry that you're targeting, right? So that you have a real understanding of the space and the opportunity, you have a great advantage in that you understand the pain in that category and kind of how to serve it because you've worked on it before. You've lived that world. But if you are, a CEO that doesn't know the space and maybe you're more technical and you have less market and or commercial experience, I think there's ways before you have to hire someone full time to kind of add to that expertise. So you can look to add an advisor who has deep industry expertise, who's, maybe served in a commercial capacity in the type of customer that you're targeting, right? So not only is that going to help you as you're developing your positioning, but it's also going to help sell your business to investors or even to customers when you can point to this person and say they're involved. Not necessarily on a full-time capacity, but involved as an advisor or on your board. You're looking to understand the strengths and weaknesses of your competitors too, and how to position yourself against those competitors. So maybe this is a person from a competitor who had worked in kind of, in a competitor at one time. So that's going to give you kind of that insight and intel that you need to best position yourself against others in the space. I almost say like it's more important to have that customer data early on than anything else. And then look to kind of add people to your marketing team over time to focus on it.
Okay, so one person is asking the question about geographic differences in a segment. So is pursuing the auto industry in the US and pursuing the auto industry in Japan, two markets or one market?
It's such a good question. It's one that we're talking a lot about right now. I think, this particular company I referenced has had success in the US in automotive and is now looking to expand into kind of international markets. I think, one thing that we're focused on right now is we actually want a unifying sales message, kind of out of the gate. So identifying what is broken and generally how the company is going to solve it should not be a moving target depending on the geography you're in. That being said, absolutely there are geographic differences in the way that, even in the way your sales relationship is pursued in these different areas. So I think, one of having boots on the ground, so people who are actually in these areas who most likely live there and have done business in these areas and know how to approach customers is super important. Doing it all from the US is a major challenge, I think. You really need to have people who are there who can establish that trust between the customer and actually move things along. But I think, like I said, if the more you start to water down your core message, your core position, it's going to be harder and harder for people to remember you and for you to kind of break through. So, like I said, one dominant statement that everything rolls up to, I think, is most important. And then figuring out how to tailor it a bit to each audience, and doing so with people who can establish trust in each of those different areas, I think is the way to go there.
Okay, great. We do have a couple more questions, but I want to shift a little bit to the workshop portion so people can see how all of your great advice actually happens. So I'm going to read the example of one startup and then ask you some questions about it. So startup one has a payments app, and it works with companies to avoid credit card processing fees. So by using their finance app, you can avoid the credit card fees, which is obviously attractive to the businesses because they're taking that couple of percentage points off. So the app can work in any industry or any company size. And it's a widely addressable market, but it makes it difficult for the startup to prioritize. So it decided to go after hospitality first because the founders had some connections in that industry.
Mm-hmm.
And they built some industry specific functionality to help them increase their viability with that space. But now they don't want to become a travel hospitality app.
Yeah.
So how do they position their company to make sure that they can get the traction that they need in this industry, but still expand into other spaces when they're ready?
Sure. Yeah, I think going after hospitality was the right move for this company. So it sounds like this is their area of expertise. Likely they had an awareness of customer pain points and how they could address those pain points. They probably had a network of potential customers they could already rely on for, early pilots or, to illustrate that their technology worked probably out of the gate. So that was, the right move. So now, if they're looking to move into another space or to expand beyond being, a travel or hospitality app, I think they need probably a few things. The first is, and this is a big thing I would say for all early stage startups, is the earlier that you can have a case study or case studies that illustrates our product is real, we have real customers. So even if you're going after a different space, if customers in this new space can say, oh, they worked with Marriott, these guys must be the real deal. It doesn't matter that it's a different space, right? So real recognizable customers that they can point to is always a great way to sell into another space. And that they were able to help save that customer money or solve their problem. So some type of result or impact that they had for the customer that they could point to, or even a testimonial from that customer. That in and of itself is a really strong asset that they can use to sell into new categories. The second thing is they probably want to go after an industry that's not going to require a ton of additional customization, right? So if they went after a space that's going to actually force them to rethink the way their product looks and functions, it's going to be longer for them to get to market and it'll be harder, right? So maybe, I don't know, for hospitality, maybe like recreational facilities or food and beverage, different areas that aren't such a huge jump from what they're working on today and won't require a ton of additional customization, I think is the way to go. And then I would say, just the way they probably obsessively researched hospitality before they entered that market, they need to go do the work to understand the new customer as well, right? And the unique value proposition that they bring to the table. So just taking their sales materials and just putting it in front of a new customer is not enough, right? So like I said, you want that core positioning statement, right? Something is broken and this is how we're fixing it. But they're going to want to evolve their sales message to meet the needs of this new customer group. So speak the language of that customer group. And that goes for the geographic example as well, right? So, but the good news is now they have real customers and real results. So the sell should actually be easier into the new space because they've already checked the box in another.
Right. Okay. Great. And so someone is actually asking, as they're thinking about that,
sure,
how do you know you're gaining enough traction before you move into the adjacent area? Like how deep do you have to go with, in this case, how deep do you go with the hotels before you move into food and beverage? Like is there some kind of framework for thinking through?
Yeah, I think, it really depends on the goals and objectives of the business, right? So maybe it's a revenue target. Maybe it's a number of customers that they had targeted for themselves. A lot of times that also has to do with the way, you know, you positioned what success looks like for this company to your board or your investors. I think, like I said, if you want to go into another space, I think you need to be able to prove that you've been successful to some capacity in the first space. And so a good number of customers, you know, a meaningful number of customers, you know, that have actually used the product. And what's important about that too is that you've kind of ironed out the kinks of the product in doing so. So you've gotten through the pilot stage, you're actually up and running, you know, 24/7 for a customer, kind of in production. And so now you know, okay, so we're not just in stealth mode anymore. We're actually out into the marketplace with real customers and real results. I think we can now be confident to enter another space. But if your product still is in beta, right, or is still in pilot and you're moving into another space before proving that you can make it work in one, it's too early.
Right. And we did get another question also about how to handle the segmentation when, I'll paraphrase here, but when your product is solving a problem, but in a unique way. So everybody's got their own biases and nobody's really quite sure how you fit, or, you know, why are you doing it this way instead of, you know, maybe the way that we're used to. So when you've kind of got that really distinct, unique way to solve a problem, is there a variation that you, when we're talking about not getting typecast, like, is there a way to, is there a difference? Like when a product might have, like in the payments app situation, that's a pretty clear problem solution statement and everybody knows what payment apps do. But if you're coming at, you know, an industry and you've got a solution that's maybe looks a little bit from left field, are there differences in how you would position the unique product?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, I think that's it's great that you're unique, because you can really brand around that and show up differently in the market space. Because there's probably, in your category, there's probably a lot of white noise, a lot of people doing things the same way or maybe incrementally better over time. But you're going in a completely different direction. And this is actually, you know, these are the brands that we love to work with. You know, we kind of call them challenger brands. So brands that are challenging the status quo, you know, the way of doing things. And so actually, you know, a good example, we have a startup that's actually based in the Massachusetts area called Soft Robotics. Soft Robotics is commercializing a technology out of Harvard that actually uses soft materials to be able to grasp and manipulate items in automation environments. So we're actually replacing the human hand or your traditional robotic gripper with a gripper that was actually inspired by the octopus to be able to kind of grasp and manipulate variable object that comes down a line in a manufacturing plant or even in an e-commerce environment. This was so out of left field for the robotics industry and the automation space. Everyone is used to kind of the traditional robotics toolkit, right? So like sensors and rigid grippers, and you know, if you go look at a automotive manufacturing facility, robots are, you know, doing the same job all day long. But the moment you enter into an environment where there's variable product like food handling or advanced manufacturing or e-commerce, there's people picking things up and placing it, because traditional robots can't pick this stuff up. So it actually took a chemist at Harvard to figure out that material science could actually solve this problem. But when you go in with a product that's based in material science and doesn't have sensors or computation or advanced vision, and you go and try to sell this thing, people were like, I don't believe you, or this is a huge departure for the way I think about robotics. So you really do have to educate the market, and that does take some time. And so the best way to educate the market is twofold. I think the company had a lot of success kind of in major media because it was such an exciting innovation, and people want to talk about what's different. News media wants to talk about what's different. But the second is, once the company had actual, real large customers, for instance, Domino's Pizza was one of the early customers, and that was out in the world. Well, now all of a sudden you have, two things. You're in media. People are talking about how disruptive you are and exciting. And oh, guess what? You actually also have customers that are using the technology and deploying it. This isn't just some very cool innovation. This is a real solution to a real problem. So, I would say that's probably the first example that comes to mind there.
So thinking through that one a little bit, because I know that you and I have talked about that one before,
Yeah.
but so Soft Robotics also had to go through this process of, they knew what problem they were solving, right? The difference to like have better motion like a hand, and to be dealing with different kinds of materials, right? Like you said, so not just like the same product and process over and over again. So what questions did they ask themselves when they said we should go into food handling as opposed to some other industry?
Actually, the company started in a completely different application area out of the gate. But they did a really important exercise, which is going out into the marketplace, right? And talking to customers. If we, and saying, if we had a robotic hand that could pick anything up, where would you use it? And the largest, the biggest pain point we found was in, what we kind of refer to as that last mile of automation and manufacturing. So picking things up and packing them, right? So with increased demand for food, with increased demand for e-commerce goods, we have a real labor problem in this country and around the world. And these are jobs that no one wants. So the turnover is huge. And these customers were pretty much saying, this is the difference between me, the economic viability of my business, or me having to shut the door tomorrow because I can't keep my business running, right? We heard, for instance, from Driscoll Strawberries that, because of the fact they didn't have enough people to be actually fulfill orders, they were abandoning like a third of their crop in the field. So this is a real problem, right? Food can't get to market, goods can't get to market. We don't have enough labor to solve for this problem. This is a huge pain point in large, meaningful markets. Like these are big, multi-billion-dollar growing markets that don't have a solution, that are just relying on people to pick and pack these items. And so, I think it was that large market opportunity, going back to what I referenced before, right? The size of the market was, undoubtedly enormous. The second was you're solving a real pain point. These were people who were saying, please, if you can solve this, we will be an early customer, right? And what I also liked about going after automation is that here's a way to take an early technology and go prove it in an environment that, where it would have to be super robust, reliable, run 24/7. Once you're able to prove it in that space, if you want to go build a robot that can unload your dishwasher, it's a lot easier, right? To say, hey, we proved ourselves in the most rigorous of environments. Now we can go and pursue other niche applications. Right. So I think those things came together to really illustrate this. This was the right market opportunity at the right time.
So you just said something that reminded me of a story in terms of, there's a lot of literature about moving from one industry to another, right? And there are stories like Hyundai and Toyota that basically sort of started at kind of the lower end of the market and moved up. But what you were just saying sounds like Soft Robotics went the other way around, which is like you start at the high end or in the more rigorous area, and then it's easier to kind of, for them at least, to kind of move down. Like, do you have a thought on that in terms of like, even within a space, like do you start like in the middle ground, or like how do you decide like where within that space you're going to go?
Yeah, I think traditionally what I've seen is starting at the high, it's better to start at the higher end, right? Like a Tesla kind of model, right? And then trickle down into the lower end. I think one is, you've kind of proven yourself, the quality standard that you're able to prove at that stage, or, in this case, kind of the reliability standard is the golden standard, right? So and also because of that standard, you're able to charge a higher price, right? So you're going to have more margin. It's a more valuable kind of market opportunity. And then I think also it's typically in some cases, so for instance, I've worked on a product in the beauty category, and most major beauty brands will introduce kind of new innovation at their very highest level, right? So that's just because they can control it a bit. They can charge a higher price point for it, so there's a willingness, but they can also kind of control that test or that pilot a bit more. They have a smaller audience, in some cases, a higher touch sales experience. And so it's a great breeding ground. And I think also it becomes a more aspirational product. So to the consumer, thinking about Tesla, you think of it as like a real high-end aspirational brand that when you can finally afford it, you want to grab it. It's much harder to kind of start in the lower end and then say, oh yeah, we want to go get to that standard at the top. So that's traditionally, I think I've seen it go in that direction.
Okay. So that's some good strategic marketing right there, thinking future direction and, already, even though you're like investing in one space, thinking with an eye toward the future about how you're going to expand, right?
Right.
So, great.
That's right.
So another scenario that we had gotten submitted was a data analytics firm that specializes in healthcare analytics. And it's had good success getting coverage in the horizontal press, right, as a data firm, a data analytics firm, and in the community, because data analytics has kind of like a big peer community there. But it hasn't had as much success positioning itself as a healthcare expert. And so now that the market has shifted in the analytics space, right, between analytics and machine learning and AI, they're not sure if they should stay as, analytics, if they should rebrand a little bit toward machine learning, toward artificial intelligence, and also trying to figure out maybe that's not the most important thing. Maybe they should think more about the healthcare side of it and positioning more of that. So they want to know how to position themselves in those areas without losing the differentiation and without making it sound like, oh, we do analytics and machine learning. And, right. And so without covering the waterfront, how can they position themselves as basically experts in two spaces, right? In the analytics and in the healthcare.
Right. Yeah, I think, this really gets at positioning is super important if you're launching in a crowded space. And I think all these words you mentioned are crowded, whether it's healthcare analytics or machine learning or AI, there's a lot of white noise. So how do you kind of stand out from the pack? And so, it sounds like what's great about this business is they've been in market, they have some results. So they're not just kind of an early company that's, just another AI company. They have results or customers. And so I think in that regard, they should use that to their advantage as a way to make themselves stand out. I think also, in a crowded space, thinking about like what it is about them that makes them different. So even if they call themselves healthcare analytics, right? Even if they call themselves AI machine learning, how do they differentiate themselves as either premium, or maybe they're discounted, or maybe they're the perfect product for a certain segment of customers. So the heading is one thing. And honestly, all of those terms, it doesn't, whatever they choose, just pick a direction and stick with it for now. But underneath it, right? What's the tagline? What's unique about the way they approach that category? And that's how they're really, I think, able to stand out from the pack. So those two things, it's, having the real customers, having real results, and then also, what it is, how in these kind of broad categories, how could they differentiate themselves? One thing also is getting at that, are we healthcare experts or are we a analytics firm? One thing I say a lot, it's kind of less important about what you say you are, it's more important what your customers say you are. So if all of their customers are like, oh, these guys are great, a great analytics firm, that's what they are. But if they are finding that in order for them to be successful, they've gotten turned away a lot because they don't have healthcare expertise. And so this gets back to that pivoting, right? So if they have enough data in the market that, hey, you really need to add some healthcare expertise in order to maybe deliver on that promise, you know, in that positioning statement that we talked about. Well, then you probably have to, again, look in the mirror and say, we are not healthcare experts. So we gotta think about how we rebuild or rebrand to be able to position ourselves as such. So, you know, a lot of times you'll find like CEOs are like, okay, I'm always going to be the spokesperson for this technology. But let's just say you found out, no, you really need healthcare expertise and you as a CEO don't have that healthcare expertise. Go find some key opinion leaders that do, who can be advisors and maybe in some cases speak on your behalf, right, at a conference, to media, because, you know, that gives you the instant credibility that you're looking for. So, you know, those are some ways to kind of think about it. I think getting back to our earlier point about investors, if you're trying to go pitch yourself to a investor that you know is talking to you because of the fact that you have AI as a component of your business, well then, you know, definitely emphasize that in your pitch. But what you emphasize in your pitch to an investor is not necessarily what you put out into the marketplace. You know, it's the most important to hear what your customers are looking for and then go deliver on that.
Right. And so you said something that I feel like we probably should hit a little harder on, which is looking in the mirror and seeing what's actually there instead of what you want to see.
That's right.
So are there tips for those of us who might have a struggle with, like, you know, they're so passionate about a space and they're so passionate about their solution,
yeah,
that maybe they're not kind of seeing what's out there? What could somebody look for or do to just kind of get a little bit more of a clear picture and a more blunt assessment for themselves?
Well, you know, you think about like any performance review you've had in an organization, you know, you get like that 360 feedback. I think going out and interviewing your customers, your investors, or the people around you, how am I perceived? How is this business perceived? You know, you recall I, you know, was talking about, oh, customers don't care that you guys are like the smart guys from Cambridge, right? So if everyone's like, you know, if everyone is saying, hey, this is a really great, smart group, but they know nothing about the industry they're going after and they're young and inexperienced, let's just say that. You want to know that because you want to think about how you build your team or build your advisory board or build up your positioning to kind of combat that a bit when you go out to your customers. So sometimes it's good to ask like a third party to do these interviews. And Christine, I'm sure you've worked with kind of marketing firms that will do this kind of audit, right? But even in your early days, just asking like, tell me, what are the strengths of this business? What are we lacking? How are we perceive, you know, how do you perceive us? And asking those tough questions, I think will give you a tremendous amount of insight and as a way of kind of holding a mirror up to your brand and your business.
Great. And so someone is asking also about a process question, right? So if we thought about some of the things that we talked about, like soft robotics being maybe a good example, or the healthcare company, if you can integrate into a workflow, so maybe you don't have an industry expertise, but maybe you have a process expertise, does that change the dynamic of how you would select your industry, right? So in terms of like whether it's you're really good at the finance process as opposed to, you know, healthcare specifically, like would that shift any of the questions you'd ask yourself as you pursue industries?
Yeah, I think that's when you kind of go back to where's the biggest market opportunity and who's experiencing the most pain, right? Because if you're expert at that process, it's okay that you don't have expertise necessarily in that one category. It's probably more important to try to go do the homework and go do the work to figure out which industry could really use your solution and why, and how you could kind of serve the needs of that industry right off the bat. So I think trying to understand size of market, that there's a real problem and that they're ready for your solution. A lot of times you'll hear from industries like, yeah, that'd be nice to have, but it's not a need to have. Like who is experiencing the most pain? You don't necessarily in that case then have to have, let's say you're going after healthcare, you don't have to have a healthcare expert on board. You may want to have eventually add someone to your team who's worked directly with the kinds of customers that you've pursued, right? So they, you know how to speak their language. You maybe already have a network there, and that's will really help you as you kind of grow your business development efforts. But I don't think you need to, if you're a process expert, don't try to be a healthcare expert too, stay in your lane.
Okay. So I want to keep us on time, so we have just a few
Sure.
minutes left. So we have really always at Startup Boston focused on education and on the practical application of what we're learning. So what's one thing that the attendees on the call could hang up from this webinar right now and go do as like a first step to thinking about how to position themselves in a space? What's one thing?
One thing. Wow. Okay. Well, maybe,
This is a starting point. Again, like just like your kickoff step.
right. Yeah. I think here's some things to think about. Maybe it's not one thing, but maybe a few things. If you want to develop your own kind of positioning, I think a good exercise to do is, first really determine your value proposition, right? So what it is about your technology that's so unique. And again, it may not be what you think, it may be what your customers are telling you. It's almost more important to get their feedback. Why did you want to buy this? What's so great about it? That's another great way to just think about, to kind of evolve the way you talk about your value.
Okay.
The other thing is you have to, and one thing we haven't really talked about is you have to research your competition a lot to figure out what they offer and how they're positioned so that you know how to position yourselves in a different way. This is probably my biggest piece of advice here in this. I see this all the time. A lot of times in researching the competition, startups get inspired by the competition and start talking like them or using language like them or making their website look like them. And now all of a sudden you're just adding to that white noise and you're not breaking through. You really want to break through as different. So research competition so you know how to be, how you can go above and beyond what they're doing and stand out as unique and better and different. So that's, using the competitor's own language in your own sales messages, that's a big no-no. And then, I think creating brand messaging that, kind of engages customers and motivates them to buy based on those things. And then be really single-minded and simple. I would say what I love about the direction that kind of branding has gone is that people are speaking in plain English again. You don't have to use a lot of fancy language. Be direct, be single-minded, don't be all things to all people. Show that you have, a real functional benefit to this customer and you're going to solve that problem and keep it simple so that they remember it, because people need to hear things 5 times before they remember it. So the simpler, the better.
Right. And keep repeating.
Yes, repeat. And it should show up in everything you do, not just on your website, your sales conversations, your pitch, when you speak at a conference, when you speak to media. Just repeat, even if it feels ridiculous, because those are the brands that stick and are memorable.
Okay, great. All right, we have 5 minutes left, and we did just get another question, so maybe we can answer really quickly before I let you go. But
sure.
To prevent stereotyping and typecasting, is disruption a bad thing or a good thing to sell into
Right.
an industry?
Sure.
Or a space. I mean, we've been talking about industry. Segmentation doesn't have to be an industry.
It totally depends. I think I was mentioning a lot of times the word disruption could scare a customer, right? That just wants their business to keep running. But if it really depends on doing that kind of customer research and competitor research, if you're finding that you're serving a space that's just so tired, so outdated, people are so fed up, then disruption is a wonderful thing, right? Because people are so ready for a change. But if you're finding that your customers are like, things are okay, we just want, we'd love to try something that could help us save more money, help us be more effective at our job, then disruption may not be the right term to use, because people think you're disrupting what I'm doing and what I'm doing is okay. That being said, I think a lot of investors, if you're positioning yourself to an investor, investors don't necessarily want to invest in incremental innovation, so things that are slightly better. They want to invest in something that's going to change the game. And so positioning yourselves as a disruptive technology to an investor audience or to media or to the mass market will definitely get you more notice than, oh, we're just version 2.0 of what already exists.
Right.
So again, it's just, you have to kind of research your space before you use a term like that to see if it would actually resonate or not.